There we go. I wanted to make sure that's recording. So, everybody, this is Todd Leopold. I actually made a joke earlier this week and said I wanted to meet the parents of Todd and Scott and figure out how to raise two completely different kids, one that manages the entire business and one that does all the distilling. I think it's probably the best balance, but that actually came up in a conversation about small family brands. And as much as Leopold Brothers is not a small brand to us anymore, it is still very much a small family, and to be able to see the face of the owner's name on the bottle is a really great connection. And Todd, sorry to kind of blow you up on this, but whenever I talk to any of our heralded producers, anybody that is really well respected in the industry, the one name that universally comes up with really amazing respect is yours. And it's a respect for not just what you do, but how well you do it, how meticulous you are, and the innovation that you put behind some things that could have been commonplace. So not to oversell how great I think your products are and everything you guys do. But guys, this is Todd Leopold. He's going to tell us a little bit about the bourbons today and maybe give us a few little spoilers for what's to come next year.
Absolutely. Well, I think the other distillers, that's just their polite way of saying that I'm old and have been around for a while. But that's certainly kind of them to say. So I'm Todd Leopold. I'm one half of the Leopold brothers. So we were sort of babbling about. My older brother is the head of the company. He got his undergraduates in industrial engineering and economics, double major from Northwestern. So that's, of course, why he's running the company and understands the numbers and the financial structure behind the company, which Ian sort of kind of touched on a little bit, how important that is. And if he wasn't running things, we would have not made it out of year one, let alone we're in our 21st year here now. He also got his master's from Stanford in environmental engineering. So we're kind of got our start as trying to make what at the time was called a zero waste distillery, as close to zero waste as you can get. These days, the phrase is sustainability, but when we started, that was not a word anybody was using. So we were a little bit ahead of the curve. So real quick on that, a typical distillery, I'm going to show you a quick, a typical distillery is, and we're already, Ian, you're going to have to help me with the pictures. That didn't take long. A typical distillery will have anywhere between, for every bottle produced, we'll have anywhere between 5 bottles of wastewater and 30 bottles of wastewater. And our distillery is at a little bit under 3 currently. And there's a lot of reasons for that are too complicated to go into right now. The easiest to explain are wooden fermenters. Our wooden fermenters, you don't clean and sanitize and use chemicals on them the same way that you would with a stainless steel fermenter, whether you're making wine, beer, spirits, or whatever, when you turn that around. So that really reduces our water usage. So that's basically what he does. My background is in brewing first. I went to a place called the Siebel Institute up in Chicago in 1995, graduated from there, went to brewing school in Germany after that, basically focusing on lager production. And Scott and I opened up a brewery when I finished up with that in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So we opened that up in 1999. We added distillation to that. I'm going to move here. I apologize. We've got a little bit of a sun issue. We added distillation to that program. We basically had a brew pub that held about 400 people. It was just a really big place. We were the closest part of the Big House, which is the big Ann Arbor football stadium. So we serve unfiltered lagers. The business wasn't all that great because in 1999, not everybody liked unfiltered lagers or beer of any kind. So the only thing that we did, thank you, Ian. The only thing that we had to try and get business going was to add distillation. So I went to There's Our Distillery Now. So we added distillation. I went to distilling school in Kentucky, went back overseas to work in distilleries in Austria and Germany, focusing on eau de vie productions, which I'll kind of touch on well with our bourbon that we have out. And then came back, and we're basically one of the first distillery pubs in the country. So we'd have all our unfiltered beers on, and we also added our vodka, a gin. We made an orange liqueur, a coffee liqueur. You get the idea. So really, we got our start basically opening opening a back bar was basically the idea behind it. Our largest customers for years were in London and San Francisco. That was the only place really that had cocktail bars back in the very early 2000s. Show Mad Men came out, and that really made brown spirits cool again, made cocktails cool again. We eventually moved away from Ann Arbor to Colorado into a small industrial strip, and then the beautiful building that you see here in the photo. I'm actually sitting in the tasting room that's just to the right of our first malt kiln. That's where I'm sitting right now. So this building is about 6 years old, and you can see the windows that are set. We're skipping ahead. That's okay. This is the expansion that we just did, and Ian's politely trying to make it so I don't run on and on about nothing. Thank you, Ian. This is our expansion. The degrees that I have in brewing, but both in Germany and in Chicago, half of the instruction was in malting. So I've had this malting education, and we built a small malt house that was adjacent to the kiln in the last photo that you saw. We've expanded. This right now that you see is our expanded malt house that we commissioned this year. That's 20,000 pounds of Colorado two-row barley that you see on the ground. This is also the base for the bourbons that we're talking about today here. So where you get your malt is important. So just real quick on that, and I'm paying attention to the time from now on, I promise, Ian. Where you get your malt is really important. And the reason is that you're not boiling the same way you are when you're making a beer. So what that means is the malted barley is rife with lactobacillus. Lactic acid bacteria lives on that barley, and when you're mashing, the warmest temperature you're using when you're making a bourbon, so for us it's 20% malted barley, you're mashing the corn together with the rye, and you're using the malt, the enzymes that are in the malt, to convert the starch to sugar. That temperature for us is 144 degrees, and at 144 degrees, that's too, I'm going to move. That's too cold. My apologies. I've never had to do a podcast this early, and we're dealing with the sun. There we go. Now you can see me. So at 144 degrees, it's too cool to denature all of the bacteria that's living on that malted barley. As a result, that the lactic acid gets into the mash and gets into the fermentation, and the lactic acid is active in the fermenters. So you'll see for some of your Scotch customers, if you've done education with them, those customers those producers will look at how many hours they're fermenting. And what they're trying to communicate to you is anything more than 72 hours, what they're telling you is that they're allowing, after 72 hours, the yeast is done. Those extra hours is allowing that lactic acid bacteria to consume things that the yeast can't. The longer that it runs, the more that bacteria is going to consume that mash and get organic acids into the mash. The reason that you're trying to do that is when you have an organic acid in a whiskey barrel, and over time oxygen creeps into that whiskey barrel, the organic acids are going to react with oxygen to create esters. So this is a very complicated way of saying the lactic acid that you have is going to affect the esteriness of your whiskey, the fruit notes of the whiskey. So the longer that you let that sit, the more of that fruit character you're going to wind up getting. And what that also means is where you get your malt matters is what I'm getting at. So malt is going to have different varieties of lactic acid bacteria, and it's going to have different quantities. And what that's going to lead to is different kinds of fruit notes. So raspberry, orange notes, that kind of thing. Amount of it is going to be dictated by where you get that malt and how long you let that fermentation go. So where you get your malt matters is what I'm trying to explain here. So let's flip on to the fermenters, if you don't mind. So our fermentation here is in open fermenters. Just to the left of where that paddle is are open windows. So what we do here is we allow for a spontaneous fermentation. So for us, we're not fermenting for that 72 hours. So after 72 hours, the yeast is done working. We let it sit for additional 48 hours. This is longer than anybody else in the whiskey industry. And the reason we're doing that, as I mentioned, is to allow that lactic acid bacteria. So if you look at that photograph, you're actually going to notice that the top of the fermenter is actually white. What that is lactic acid that's aggressively working on the top of that mash to consume things that the yeast can't. And what's really wonderful is we had whiskey in a production in a building that was, our first building is about 4 blocks away from here. We added the garden that we have that's just outside the windows to allow for, we've got rose bushes, we've got peach trees, we've got pear trees that are outside that allow the generation of more wild yeast, of more bacteria. There you go. So you see the windows that are on the basically kind of dead center. You can see them cracked open. The fermenters are on the other side of that. So it's hard to see, but you can see rose bushes, lavender that's just underneath the windows, and to the left you can see the edges of the trees. We let all these trees go to rot, and our building is designed so that those windows that you see that are open are actually our air intake. So it's intentionally drawing air out of the garden across the fermenters and up at the top. So what that's going to do as time rolls by is it's making it so that we're getting wild yeast and bacteria impregnating those fermenters. And over time, we're going to start to get a house note from this very specific environment. And the house that we're getting is a compound called octyl acetate that comes from lactic acid bacteria. And it's getting, and there's a point to this, I promise, you're getting an orange marmalade note that crosses through into all of our whiskeys. And what's wonderful is we had a building that was 3 blocks away from here doing the same production methods, no orange marmalade note. Why? Because we changed the environment that all of our mash is fermenting in. And as a result, we're getting unique whiskey with a sense of place. I still haven't found a better word than terroir. Terroir sounds kind of snooty to me and doesn't quite fit. But it's a sense of place. Where your fermenters are matters. Where your malt comes from matters. So for some of your larger producers, they don't really like to talk about that when we're talking about malt whiskey. If they have changed where they have gotten that malt from, it's going to change their whiskey, full stop. Because bacteria that they get is going to be different, coming from a different region, coming from a different malt house. So some of the older distilleries that had floor maltings that they shut down, they've changed their whiskey. So in any event, that's how we handle the fermentation here. So a few of the things that makes it really simple in terms of what makes our bourbon different from Kentucky style bourbon. Kentucky style bourbon, which is beautiful. We're just making something different. I'm not explaining that theirs is bad and ours is good, just ours is different, and here's how. First of all, we ferment very cold. We ferment in the 60s. Most of the larger distillers and smaller ones like to ferment in the 90s. The reason they do that, at warmer temperatures, you're basically stressing yeast out, and they're stressing the yeast out intentionally with these higher temperatures. When you stress yeast out, they give off esters. Okay, so what they're trying to do is get fruit notes into their whiskey. That's enormous. So to me, the big one is a compound called isobutyl acetate. We're going to nerd out just a little bit here, which is really, really big raspberry notes. That's kind of the hallmark of a Kentucky whiskey, unless, of course, we're talking Jim Beam. With their yeast, when they stress their yeast out, it gives off isoamyl acetate, which smells like bananas or banana cream pie. But that's from using those warmer temperatures. At Leopold Brothers, we ferment much cooler. This is left over from my German lager production days. The reason for that is I want to make it so that I'm not producing those esters through hot fermentation. I'm trying to create our esters through the bacterial fermentation that I just mentioned. So we're going after those esters in a very different way. So we're using colder temperatures. As a result of that, we're not creating the biggest ester of all, which is ethyl acetate, which tastes like nail polish remover. So most of you will explain that or describe that as hot or heat or boozy or something like that, that your perception of a whiskey is hot. So you're going to notice with our bourbons that they're very soft. Why? We're using much lower temperatures. Okay. So we're going after the esters through a back door, and the esters are much more subtle. The other thing that I mentioned earlier is that we use a very high proportion of malt. So a lot of the whiskey nerds out there are calling our bourbon malt forward, which I'm totally stealing. That's a very clever way of explaining it. The reason for that is a lot of them, instead of using 20%, a lot of the distillers will use 3 to 5%. What that tells you is that they're mashing. The malt is being used to convert the starches into sugars into a mash tun. What that means is they're using off-the-shelf enzymes. The enzymes are converting the starch into sugars, which means they can get away with lowering the amount of malt that they're putting in. We like to mash naturally here, just like they do in Scotland and Germany with the German purity law. So I use a much higher amount, that 20%, to make sure that I'm converting all of the starches in the corn and the rye without any problem at all. The result of that is malted barley, the particular type of distiller's malt that we use, it's kilned at a very low temperature. Suffice it to say that distiller's malt tastes similar to barley. Okay. So our bourbon is going to have this nice grassy note, just like you would get in an Irish whiskey, essentially. Irish whiskey uses a high proportion of malted barley. Distiller's malt, the way that it's made, it's kilned at such low temperatures, it really retains the flavor of raw barley. So you can really kind of think of it as adding 20% raw barley to the grist, and as a result, you're going to get that nice grassy note. So those are two things now. So the lower temperatures get you a much softer whiskey. That 20% malted barley gets you a kind of nice soft grassy note into it. In addition to that, because we're not using those higher temperatures, the first thing that you're smelling and tasting isn't this big face full of esters, because the esters are much more subtle. What does that do? It makes it so you can taste the notes from and the contribution from the corn and the rye. So this is really basically a bourbon that's really a different style from Kentucky bourbon. So if you have fans that are looking for something different and who complain about, all the different offerings from MGP, which is beautiful whiskey, beautiful bourbon, and beautiful rye, but of course there's so much of it out there. What we're offering is really something different that's produced in an entirely different manner. Ian, if you want to pull up the stills, we use pot distillation. We're distilling it 2 times. Nothing too complicated about that. We're mashing. You can see on the far left here, these are eau de vie stills. That's what we use to produce our gins, to produce our absinthe, anything where we're looking for a refined aroma. You can see kind of in the center, the 3 stills behind that. Those are our pot stills. That's what we use to produce our bourbon. So we're distilling it 2 times and we're cutting it down to 50% alcohol. Ian, if you can move to the Dunnage warehouse. So this is another thing that's very, very, very different at Leopold Brothers. Our entry proof is at the industry low. We're in at 100 proof for 50% alcohol. This is what American distillers did for a good solid 100 years. Everybody was putting their whiskey in at that 50% alcohol mark. I know this. If you can't tell, I'm a bit of a nerd and doing research into American distilling history. I have a bunch of papers, one paper in particular where they did a survey of 33 different distilleries in the 1800s and went through everything from mash bill to was the warehouse heated, what was your entry proof. Every single one of those distillers was at the maximum that they were in was at 50.5% alcohol. So they were in at 50 or 50.5. That changed in the 1960s. In 1965, the government raised the allowable entry proof from 55% all the way to 62.5. Why? Because the distilleries were all shutting down in Maryland and Pennsylvania. They were getting their butt kicked by James Bond because, as we all know, men are dumb and thought that they could be James Bond if they drank what he drank. And so brown spirits started to decline at that time. White spirits started to go up. All these distilleries, whiskey distilleries in Pennsylvania, Maryland shut down and shuttered in the 1960s. And they were trying to find a way to make it so that they could keep the doors open. So what did they do? They petitioned the government to say, can we go into the barrel at a higher proof? Obviously, going in at 62.5 instead of 50, what does that mean? You're cramming more whiskey into fewer barrels, and you need fewer rick houses. This is a money-saving measure that they did. The problem with that, in my opinion, is that changes all the chemical reactions that are happening inside that barrel. Alcohol is a solvent, so at that higher proof, it's going to extract more compounds, in my opinion, tannins and other compounds that you're not looking for. But the most important thing to think about is what happens when it comes time to bottle that whiskey. So if you're in at 50% alcohol like we are, and the proof doesn't go up in the warehouse that you're seeing, so it's out at 50%, when you're adding water, I'm only adding a few liters to get it down to that 45%. If you're in at that 62.5%, like so many distillers are, what happens when it comes time to bottle? You're adding a third again, in some cases a little more than that, water. You're washing out all the flavors that you work so hard to develop inside that barrel. So to me, it just seems counterintuitive to do that. So we're in at 50% for our bottled and bond. We are in at 50%. It is aging for 5 years, and the proof does not move in our warehouse. This is the only warehouse in the world where the proof doesn't move. I wish I could tell you that I designed it that way. Sadly, I'm not that smart. The design that we did was to try and make it so that the evaporation rate was lowered. So as you can see here in the warehouse, there's a center strip of concrete. This is what's called Dunnage style storage. Dunnage refers to the ladder looking stuff that you stack between the barrels. This is much more common in Scotland, but the important thing that we're seeing is the earthen floors. So that's intentional. So the building that you see here in the photo, it's surrounded by plants. We put drainage on the outside and drip irrigation to feed these Colorado native plants. The reason we did that drip irrigation, we're trying to make sure that the earth is moistened inside that warehouse. The result of this is that warehouse, the relative humidity is 20% higher than it is outside. Why is that important? We're in Colorado in a very dry climate, and if we don't do something to mitigate the dryness, we're going to have an angel share that will get in the double digits. So the angel share that you get in Scotland, I'm generalizing here, so please don't yell at me if you have different numbers, but in Scotland, most warehouses, your angel share, the evaporation of the whiskey out is about 2.5% a year. In Kentucky, you can expect about 4.1, 4.5% per year. Here in Colorado or in Texas or in Arizona where the climate's so dry, so everybody remembers 8th grade chemistry, you got your permeable membrane, you got your whiskey sitting in the barrel. How much water you have sitting up in that air is going to affect how aggressive that evaporation is. Generally speaking, the more water that you have in the air, the more it's going to slow the evaporation rate. So a lot of the distilleries in Denver and in the West, what they'll do is they'll mature inside and they'll add humidity. They'll have misters going in their building to try and get the humidity up to drop the evaporation rate, because if you don't, those of you who are familiar with Garrison Brothers is the example I always like to use. They just let Texas do its thing, which is beautiful. It's a wonderful choice that they're doing, but their evaporation rate is in the double digits. And if we had double digit evaporation rates here, my brother would probably look for another distiller. So what we did was we designed this warehouse to try and slow that evaporation rate. And that evaporation rate for us is around 4.1%. So it did its job. It's reducing the amount of evaporation that we're going to get. And it's also allowing us to handle our maturation more sustainably. If you didn't notice, there's no lights in that. Those are just light panels, diaphanous panels that the sun can get through. There's no heating in this building as well, so we're letting Colorado do its thing. Today, it's probably going to be a high in the 50s. It really doesn't get cold in Denver until January, February, but in January, February, because it's so cold, what's happening? The evaporation slows. It's not evaporating as aggressively. It's also not extracting as many tannins out. So where you mature your whiskey is very, very important in trying to get that final whiskey. And like all things that here at Leopold Brothers, we're trying to give it a sense of place so that this whiskey can only be made in one place. So we're letting Colorado do its thing. We're in at that 50%. We're in at that 50% ABV. Again, what is that going to do? That's going to make it so it's not extracting as much tannin and other compounds out of the wood. And that's going to yield a much softer whiskey. So the oak presence in our whiskey isn't going to be as heavy as other distilleries is that are using that higher proof. That higher proof is going to extract more vanillin, more of those maple sugar notes, more of those compounds, which is great. That's just another path. What we're trying to do is making so that our barrel, the effects of the barrel on our whiskey is balanced. So to kind of roll through, that 20% malted barley is going to give it a grassy note. That colder fermentation is going to make it so that the esters are much more subtle. So it's easier to taste the corn, the rye, and the barley that we have going on. And that entry proof at 50% is going to make a much, much softer whiskey. So our bottled and bond version, and if you don't mind pulling up the bottled and bond photo, Ian, our 5-year bottled and bond that is unfiltered, that's cask strength that you're seeing right there. Now, we didn't put the words cask strength on it because we didn't want to confuse your customers. We certainly, when you say cask strength, usually that means something that's in the 60s. And they pick up the bottle and say, well, why is it, if it's cask strength, why is it 50%? We're trying to make your life a little bit easier. So we just decided to call it bottled and bond, nice and simple. As you can see at the bottom, we're doing these barreling seasonally. The bottling seasonally. So we're taking a collection of whiskey in that photo that you see right now, if my eyes aren't cheating me, that we put down in the spring of 2015. So instead of batch numbers or barrel numbers like we had before, what we're doing now is we're bottling according to season, because as I mentioned, because of that wild fermentation that we're doing and we're having the effects of that garden, the whiskey that we make in the spring is going to be different than what we make in the summer. It's going to have a difference on the whiskey. And we want to share that with the consumers and let them understand, hey, this really is something that's quite different and quite unique. And that's our bourbon in a 30-minute nutshell, which isn't easy to do. Obviously, if you can't tell, I could have been talking about this for 4 hours and bore all of you to tears, but I think we got a decent summary. So this is not Kentucky style whiskey. We do so many things that are very different, and for your customers that are really looking for something unique, something that's made with intentionality, all the choices that I made to craft this whiskey, what was intentional. We're trying to make a whiskey that's different. We don't want to make the same thing that everybody else is making, because if it sounds pompous, I apologize, but on the artistic side of things, what's the point of making something that tastes like what everyone else is doing? So Ian, do you want to field any questions?
Yeah, so I did get one question from Luke. Actually, he's got a couple of them. One is, have you ever considered doing a single malt? Which is interesting because, this program is so unique. I did want you to briefly touch on the barrel program and what would set that apart from the core line. If you can just get a couple of bullet points from that. But mostly the comment section has been a lot of praise and attention for the geeky details.
It's hard to do in 30 minutes. That much I'll say. So the number of barrels per batch is right around 5. So very small. For folks that are looking to do a barrel select program, if you're looking for a customer to do something unique, what I'll do is I'll pick 3 barrels for them. We'll send out the samples. Nice little handwritten note in a box will arrive. We're COVID friendly, I guess, trying to make the package a little bit easier for them to handle, and they can make a choice out of three separate barrels. And we usually like to make it so there's at least a year between the barrel selection, so you get a pretty wide swath of choices. And for the barrel select, we bottle that at 50%, so it's just straight out of the barrel, undiluted. And we're happy to do that. You just have to reach out to your spirit specialist coordinator, and they'll help you do that. And I'm happy to select them. And of course, if you haven't figured out, I'm the one pulling the barrel selections. So that's kind of a nice little touch on that side.
Question from Chris Luke was, are there cocktails that you feel express the bourbon's profile the best? I think it's probably a great question too. Do you have a favorite cocktail with anything that you produce?
Yes, that's a great question. Boulevardier. A Boulevardier. So because our oak present isn't so huge, because the ester note, so an easy way, if you can think of this plotted on a gas chromatograph, this is Kentucky bourbon, huge esters, including that ethyl acetate heat. This is ours. It's much more subtle. Our bourbon rewards a bit more patience. It's not as big. Instead of being at, if you borrow Spinal Tap, if Kentucky bourbon's at 11, we're at about a 6. So it's much more subtle. It's more of a finesse bourbon. But a Boulevardier, because that oak present isn't as aggressive, oh, it just makes a beautiful Boulevardier. I'm a big fan of that.
Awesome.
Do you want me to mention the three Oh, go ahead, please. I'm sorry, Ian.
Ralph had a question about differences between bottled and bond in Kentucky versus Colorado. Are there any?
Well, no. I mean, outside of all of the production methods that I mentioned, bottled and bond, well, all that means is you're taking it from 1 year. So you can't take a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old and blend it together. It has to come from the same year and from the same distilling season. So the spring of 2015. It can be 8 years old, but it has to all be 8 years. So the bottled and bond for us is a 5 years old in this case. And then the three chamber whiskey that we're planning on releasing in January. What I'm hoping is at some point we can have you all back and we can figure out a way to do a tasting for that. We have a video that we're putting together that explains how the 3-chamber works. This is a unicorn still that we had built for us a little over about 5 years ago, I guess now. But it was the still of choice used to make rye whiskey back in the 1800s. I had one built for us at Vendome out of Kentucky, and it makes a whiskey that's unlike anything you've ever had before. And that one's going to be a real fun one for if you guys have a serious whiskey account, they're going to want this whiskey because it's the only one in the world, and the flavors and the aromas are completely unlike anything you've had before. And you just have to wait for us to get it in your hands, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So how's that for a simple teaser, Ian? Is that good?
That's really good. That's not necessarily going to be readily available going forward, though, right? It's more of a limited release.
Oh, no, it'll be readily available. You guys will be able to get within reason as much. We put down in our minds an awful lot of it. So it is something you're going to be able to get your hands on. It's just a relative thing, I guess. We don't like to count our chickens. I think it's going to be in high demand, but I also think your customers are going to be able to get it. We'll find out the hard way.
Beautiful.
Todd, I just wanted to say hello and thank you for coming on this morning. It's so wonderful to see you. Absolutely. I started out the geeky chat by saying I could literally listen to you talk about this every morning. It is so fascinating. There are 190 people all down the East Coast from Winebow. So like all of those teams, we are so proud to support you. All of your pioneering efforts. I mean, you and your brother, you guys are so exemplary of the partnerships that we love and want to grow. And I can't wait to taste these bourbons. Thank you so much. This has been really amazing. We linked a bunch of videos out in the chat. If some of you haven't seen it, the Raising a Glass that we did, your recent Sip of Knowledge with Marty and Lou, and lots of material out there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for taking the time to do this, and hopefully we can arrange something in the springtime on the 3-chamber still. We will have videos that explain it from soup to nuts because it is complicated and because of COVID. I can't visit your accounts in person I'm going to use the word lecture on it because it's something you can talk about for an awful long time, but the long and the short of it is we make whiskey that's very different. So you are going to have customers, if they expect Kentucky bourbon and they try ours, some aren't going to care for it, and that's okay. But just, make sure that they know, hey, this is really made using different production processes. And for the folks that are looking for something unique and that is made differently, we think we're going to have a lot of people that are going to enjoy these whiskeys. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time. And I hope everybody's families are healthy and safe. And our best from the Leopold family.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. And just a quick reminder, we launched, and right now, Georgia's in the lead. New York is second and Florida is third, but I know we're all going to crush it. We all like some healthy competition. So I had to throw that out there. And thank you, Todd. You were the last distillery I got to visit in February with Richard. So I hold that very dear to my heart. I'm honored that I get to come out before all of this, but it's great to see you. And thank you, everyone, for jumping on.
Absolutely.
We really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys.
Be safe out there. Happy Friday, guys.